Deborah, thank you very much. Just wanted to emphasize one thing, the context of today, this being Premier 14. That means that this is the 14th year we've had this program, and without the contributions of our alumni and all of our generous gifting that's being done, we couldn't have this kind of amazing activity. And again, thanks to all of you for participating. And one of the things that we used to always do as a highlight of this event is get a nationally prominent speaker to come in and speak to us. This year, we have a nationally prominent speaker. The unique thing is that the nationally prominent speaker happens to be one of us, or one of the people from our program. Tom Leslie, Professor Tom Leslie is that person. And Tom really represents several firsts, as part of our program. Tom is the Picard Chilton's professor, endowed professor. That professorship is the very first endowed professorship in the entire College of Design. So it's a first and a prestigious honor for Tom. Secondarily, another first, Tom has served over this last year and received the prestigious Rome Prize. Again, the first ISU faculty member to have received this prestigious Rome Prize, and has been doing his research nearly for the last year in Rome. And so this is truly a nationally prominent speaker we're having join us today. And Tom himself embodies really the balanced perspective that we really value, that our students and our program values here at Iowa State. Tom began his career as a practitioner for Norman Foster's office, really one of the prominent international offices in the country. And we were fortunate to have him enrich his opportunity by joining us here at Iowa State in 2000, which just happened to be the year I joined as well. So I've been able to really watch Tom grow and excel in that academic career the whole time. And so he's flourished over that time really as an author, multiple books, and for that success, he has received recognition from numerous resources, the groups that support academia and support practice. He received award recognition from the American Institute of Architects, the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture, U.S. Green Building Council, the Graham Foundation, American Philosophical Society, and National Endowment for the Humanities. All of these groups have honored Tom for his great success. He's also been invited to serve as a visiting professor at prestigious universities in Germany and in Chicago. And we have we're now getting him back, from his time away. And we thought so well of him, Deborah thought so well of him, that he's named him the new director of our graduate education program. And so we're pleased to have him back and pleased to give him that recognition. And I would like to, it's my honor and privilege, to introduce Tom, and please help me welcome him back to the university.
Thanks, Tom. Well, thank you so much, Cal, and to Deborah and the lecture committee for inviting me. And thank you for the welcome home. It is really good to be back home. It was a great year, of course, but to be back in front of a home crowd means a lot to me, and I couldn't be happier to come back and to kick the year off with the chance to show you some of the things that I've found and some of the things I've worked on this past year. I'm incredibly grateful to this place, this university, this department, In the 14 years I've been here, I've gotten to do some amazing things, and going to Rome, of course, tops them all. There are colleagues here tonight, friends, family, who made sure that my life was in order while I was gone, and who made sure that everything was in place when I got back. And of course, a partner who is both inspirational and incredibly supportive. Maybe bigger, though, I'm grateful to all of you. There are moments sitting in Rome where I felt like, oh my God, I'm just this like little guy from downstate Illinois. What am I doing here? And there were other moments when I really genuinely felt proud to be coming from where I'm from, not just my hometown, but also from this place, this university, this department. We are truly an international school. People know about us. People in Rome especially know about us. Those of you who have scholarships to go to Rome, I am so envious. You get to study and to work in this amazing program that we have over there. And the Rome show that you all are going to see after I'm done demonstrates that, I think, at its finest. The work that I saw while I was over there from these students is really amazing. So the lecture tonight is intended as a very modest but very heartfelt thank you to all of you. It's, of course, a report to shareholders in a way. But it's also, you know, really all I've got to say how much I appreciate coming from here and how much I appreciate the support and the enthusiasm and the excitement when we all found out that I had this. I'm going to try to tell a good story, of course, but I've tried to take that story and put just enough sort of English on it so that I have an excuse to show you some really amazing stuff. There are some new drawings that I did, which are fine, but there are also a whole lot of construction photos, drawings and sketches from Nervi's archives that have never been published before, and some of them I'm absolutely sure have never been seen outside of the archives before. So I'm very glad that you all get to be the first to see some of these. Can I get the, Kimberly, which light switch is it? That one? Huh. Ladies and gentlemen, our own award-winning Rob Whitehead. The title of my talk tonight, and the sort of working title for the project, is Beauty's Rigor. And this comes from a long poem written by William Carlos Williams. One of the great things about a fellowship at the Academy is that you have time, and you get to do things like read that you don't often get to do in sort of daily life. And this is one of Williams's best known works, but maybe one of his least read because it's such a huge, such a...
We're trying to make sure that he can see you.
Oh, you don't want to see me, you want to see the slides, I'm sure. All right. Perfect. All right. It takes more than a village. It takes a small town, for sure. So this poem by Williams called Patterson, which he took 10 years to write and publish. And not coincidentally, this is exactly the time of some of the most important buildings by Nervi that I'll show you. But more importantly, there's a kind of thematic resonance here. Williams was trying to argue for a kind of return to the real world, right? High modernism had been very abstract in literature, and Williams was trying to get back down to the sort of stuff of life. And to do this, the poem's set in Paterson, New Jersey, and his point was trying to prove that beauty, unlike this sort of opening line of the poem where he says that beauty is locked in the mind, he wanted to show that beauty was out in the world. And I'll come back to this and explain why this kind of frames the talk I want to give tonight. I've been interested in Nervi for a long time. Nervi was one of the great heroes in Foster's office, and one of those architects and designers that people talked about all the time. He's known as a structural engineer, which he certainly was, He's best known perhaps for the buildings that he did for the 1960 Rome Olympics, the Palazzetto dello Sport on the left, maybe the best known of those. He was trained as a structural engineer and certainly had a practice as a structural engineer. But what's often forgotten about him is that he was also a builder. He was also a contractor. And in addition to the office along the Tiber River in Rome, he had a working yard, an experimental yard in southern Rome, in Maliana, where his firm actually experimented with concrete techniques. And most of the buildings that he's best known for were not only designed in the engineering firm, but actually built by Nervi and Bartoli, the contracting firm. And this, to me, has become increasingly important. I've always been interested in structural engineering. I've been more and more interested in how structural engineering and construction kind of argue with one another and in turn argue with design, and how really good designers are able to sort of synthesize all three of these things. So for me, Nervi is perfect. He's trained as an engineer, he's trained as a builder, not trained as an architect, although his son was, and his son Antonio played a bigger and bigger role in the firm through the 60s. What the project that I went to Rome to do involved trying to understand where Nervi's work came from, why his work seems so much more engaging, so much more beautiful, so much more thoughtful than a lot of the structural engineering and architecture that went on during the same era. And what I came back with is an understanding that Nervi was sort of uniquely poised to take advantage of things that were going on in Italy. But his career was also uniquely constrained by the economy, by the political situation, and by the resources that he had to work with. And like many great architects, like many great designers, those constraints didn't frustrate him necessarily, but those constraints actually sort of forged this very, very disciplined approach to designing things and to building things. And the engineering, the design, the building all sort of reinforced each other because they had to. And I want to talk about those constraints tonight, and I want to talk about how Nervi sort of forged this way of working out of them. And then I want to sort of blow that up into this larger discussion about ideas and things, and about why we think of beauty and rigor as separate things, and maybe why we should think of them as conjoined instead. So the talk will be in three sort of brief acts. The first one I want to talk about is autarky. This was a political and economic situation of Italy when Nervi was coming up and when he began his practice. I want to talk about il cantiere, which is Italian for the job site, but also Italian for the shipyard. And I want to explain why I think this is fundamental to understanding Nervi's work, that it's not just a construction site, but it's this idea of the shipyard that permeates his work, and why that matters. And then finally, ideas and things. I'll leave that one for the moment, and we can come back around to that. So to begin with, autarky. It's a funny word that means self-sufficiency. But in Italy in the 1920s and 1930s, it meant something far more serious and really far more sinister. If you look at a map of resources, natural resources in Europe, you see things that we sort of know almost by heart. That there's an iron belt that runs through northern Europe, that England, for instance, has natural deposits of iron ore. France and Germany certainly have natural deposits of iron ore. And this is where the kind of metal, steel, iron revolution really took place. In England in the 18th century, Germany and France in the 19th century, and it spread sort of through northern Europe in the 20th. But if you look closely, you'll find that Italy has no naturally occurring iron ore deposits. There's a small historic one that the Romans used on the island of Elba, but it's very tiny. It was used when iron was still a very precious metal. And if you think about sort of industrializing the production and the use of iron, Italy has had to import virtually everything that it's ever built with, in iron and in steel. There's a similar map that shows coal reserves in Europe. These are both published in 1921, right about the time that Nervi was beginning his own practice, early in his own practice. And you see the same thing. Italy has not only always had to import its iron, but it's had to import its energy. It has no naturally occurring coal resources to speak of. It has to bring coal in the 1920s from Great Britain. And it's also had to do this with petroleum. So it has an iron deficit and it has an energy deficit. One of the solutions that you see in the southern European countries to the lack of metal, to the lack of steel, is a reliance on concrete. When we think of the great concrete engineers, particularly Torroja in Spain and Nervi in Italy, these are southern European phenomena. And there's a kind of southern European approach to concrete that again comes from necessity. There's not enough steel to build like they did in France and Germany and England. And so they instead turned to concrete. Concrete was perfected as a structural material really in France by Anabic around the end of the 19th century. And you can see that in the Système Anabic, he has taken concrete's strength in compression and combined it with minuscule amounts of steel reinforcement that take up the tension that goes into a bending member. And what this means is that you're essentially tricking concrete into thinking that it's a metal, into thinking that it's steel, into behaving like that. It can take bending in a way that raw concrete or stone or brick can't take. And you can see the development of these skeletal systems of concrete around the end of the century that sort of look like steel skeletons, but are built predominantly with the material that was cheaper and that was available in more parts of Europe. The Système Anabic applied not only to buildings, to warehouses and factories, but also to bridges. And in 1911, when Nervi was a young student in the engineering school at the University of Barcelona, University of Bologna, one of the great achievements in concrete engineering happened just down the coast in Rome. The Tiber River, which for centuries had been bridged with multiple stone arches, was finally bridged in one single span. And this used the patented system that Anabic developed. It was designed and built by a licensee of the Anabic system named Porcedu. And it relied on the monolithic nature of concrete to achieve this. There's a famous incident where a group of German engineers wrote to Porcedu and to some of the professors at the University of Rome and said, we're very worried. We've seen the drawings for this bridge. We've done the calculations and it simply can't stand. It's too thin. You need to stop construction immediately. And the letter that went back said, thank you very much for your concern. We finished the bridge 6 months ago and it's fine, right? Nervi told this story over and over and over again. As big as a fan as he was of concrete, he hated academic engineers and used to tell the story again and again and again as the lesson being that what's actually out there in the world, right, what's actually tested is important. The reason that the Ponte Risorgimento stands when traditional methods say it should fail is that concrete is monolithic. Steel is elemental. When you build a steel structure, you're combining dozens and dozens of little pieces with joints that all can move just a little bit. What this means is that you have to think of every piece in the structure as an individual element and consider how it behaves on its own. With concrete, if it's designed right, the entire structure functions as one monolithic thing. So a load applied to the bridge will find its way, will find the most efficient way to get to the supports of the bridge almost no matter what. Nervi described it as the structure doing the engineering for you. This doesn't work if the shape is really crazy, but for a shape where you can imagine a load path, concrete will typically carry a load very efficiently. This was a huge lesson for Nervi, and it's one of the things that he refers to constantly, is that concrete, being monolithic, has this advantage over steel. We can't understand necessarily how the structure, how the forces are flowing through it quite as well, but it has this multiple redundancy that lets it carry surprising loads that in steel it wouldn't be able to carry at all. So at Bologna, Nervi studied under two professors. This again is right at the time when concrete is sort of taking over from steel as the high-tech material of choice. And his professor Attilo Muggia was a constructor. Nervi went to work for him for several years after graduating. And Muggia taught really from the ground up, taught from the principles of construction, and from those sort of figured out how the building would stand. Silvio Canavazzi, on the other hand, was one of the leading theorists of concrete engineering. Canavazzi didn't build. He sat there and did the math. And somewhere between these two, Nervi found this happy medium, knowing what the theory was, but also knowing how it was built, right? From the sort of world of math down to the real world, but also from the real world up. He went to work for Muggia and then set out on his own in 1920, and for several years did these very, very pedestrian, very, very pragmatic factory buildings, particularly in the textile town of Prato. These are all essentially based on Anna Beek's system. If you look at the image on the top, you basically see a reinforced concrete skeleton, very much like Anna Beek had patented. Nothing really terribly innovative. Nervi developed a reputation as a very effective designer of factories and warehouses. And you can see in the bottom that there's a kind of, at least a sort of thoughtful approach to things like daylighting, to things like long span structures and trusses, all executed in concrete. But Nervi's early career occurred against a political background that is impossible to ignore. In the 1920s in Italy, Mussolini had just come to power in 1922. And part of the propaganda campaign that Mussolini relied on was autarky, that Italy should be entirely self-sufficient, that Italy didn't need the rest of the world. This got even more serious in the 1930s after the country invaded Ethiopia. The rest of the world brought crippling economic sanctions down on the country, and suddenly Italy was actually forced into this very serious autarkic economic policy. In some sense, that meant that concrete was even more of a desirable material. Because all of the materials for concrete were available in country, reinforcing was not, and so this was a difficult negotiation. You see buildings by architects like Piacentini. This is the University of Rome, constructed in 1935, of what Nervi called weak concrete. Concrete that was almost all bearing, that was under-reinforced, that didn't have the amount of steel that we would typically expect to see in it today. And you can see that the columns here are very big, the windows are very small. It looks like a Roman brick building in terms of its proportions. And it's clad in travertine, which was, of course, Italy's #1 kind of building material to export. So this is seen as an autarkic building by the fascist regime. And Nervi had a sort of ambivalent relationship with the government and the political system at the time. He was, for a short time, the leader of the fascist engineering syndicate in Florence, but after a year he resigned, which was politically and professionally problematic. And in 1938, he wrote a series of articles where he criticized the regime's reliance on stone and brick and this weak concrete, and basically said that if we were to build in this truly autarkic manner, if we were really to go back to Roman times and build vaults and walls of brick and mortar, lime and pozzolana, these are all materials that are found in country. At first glance, he says, it seems the cheapest and most autarkic. But as soon as we get to large spans, large loads, buildings that are of any scale at all, what we find is that we need to take the tension stresses, the bending stresses that steel handles so well and that concrete doesn't. And the amount of brick, the amount of weak concrete gets to be so much that we start looking at the energy cost. And the energy cost of producing all of that material, of moving all of that material around, means that we're actually spending more in gold. And when he says gold here, he essentially means foreign currency. Right? They're having to pay another country to get the coal or the petroleum that they need to make all of this material. As soon as we get to a fairly large size, we find that iron or other materials, even though their unit costs in foreign currency are higher, they're actually cheaper and therefore more autarkic. Right? It's a very sophisticated argument. It's one that didn't win him a lot of friends in the government, but it's one that we recognize today, that when you're thinking about the energy costs of a building, you're not just looking at the cheapest material to buy, you're looking at the material that costs the least in terms of transportation and production, things like that. It's like the debate over aluminum, right, which is the kind of dirtiest, most energy-intensive material we can use, but we can get more performance out of an ounce of aluminum than we can get out of an ounce of brick, right? So so we actually have to be thoughtful about it. And Nervi's making a similar argument here in 1938. Nervi's strongest argument for concrete, though, was this incredible set of hangars that he built for the Italian Air Force in the late 30s. He got the commission in part because he had this sort of dual office. He had a structural engineering office and the contracting office. And he was able to undercut all of his competitors. He did this in a couple of ways. The initial set of hangars built at Orvieto in 1937 have this vaulted lamella roof. Lamella just means diamond-shaped. And what those ribs do is it tricks the concrete shell into thinking it's much deeper than it really is, into behaving like a much, much deeper shell than it really is. When people see this, they often think of the Pantheon, right, which has these great deep coffers that sort of scoop out dead weight of the dome so that the dome thinks it's really thick, but only weighs as much as a thinner dome. And there's a similar process here. The lamella pattern means that the hangar roof resists gravity loads and wind loads with the same ribs, the same structures. And you can see that it's set up on relatively skinny buttresses that run all the way around the back. This was a cheaper hangar than anything the Italian Air Force had built to that date. And there was the claim that it was sort of autarkic, right? That this was all done in concrete. And this is where the archives come in. Nervi wrote a couple of very cryptic things where he said that actually these hangars were kind of a failure and never really elaborated on it. But when you look at the construction process, what you realize is that the monolithic nature of that concrete, the fact that the shell is all one piece, meant that Nervi had to build the hangar twice. He had to build a complete timber formwork for the entire hangar and then pour the concrete into that formwork. Timber is the last resource that Italy really doesn't have enough of. Italy's been over-forested for a couple thousand years. The Romans harvested many of the forests for energy and coal, and timber is another thing that the countries had to import. So when you look very closely, you realize that that photo on the left is mostly probably imported timber. And it's essentially an entire timber hangar that's only built so that Nervi can then come in and pour the concrete hangar into it. And as for the reinforcing, this was a real shocker to find this, that as those ribs come down and collect all of this force, all of these loads, as they enter into those buttresses, what you're looking at isn't really concrete. What you're looking at is steel with a little bit of concrete sort of painted on the outside, right? This is a heavily, heavily reinforced solution. And Nervi wrote sort of despairingly of these that, you know, everyone thought that these were these incredible examples of new engineering, and Nervi alone knew that they were essentially a failure, that they were claimed to be autarkic, and in fact they were heavily reliant on foreign materials. So in the Magliana Yard in southern Rome, and if you know Rome, to the right of the picture you can just see the Square Colosseum in AUR. This is the thing you see when you're coming in on the train from the airport. Nervi's solution to this was to try to find a way to eliminate most of the timber formwork, right? To see if he could actually prefabricate elements of the hangars, lift them into place on smaller, lighter formwork, and then use small bits of reinforced concrete to kind of glue all those pieces together, right, to get a monolithic structure out of a lot of very small pieces. And there are these photos of him sort of playing around with this idea in Magliana. You can see these are, if you've had a little bit of structures, you realize this is a Vierendeel truss shaped like an arch. Each one of those little hollow units is an independent piece. And this sketch from the archives, this to me is like the find, right? One day in the archives, finding this sketch and kind of losing my mind, right? Not really able to explain to the archivist in my sort of bad Italian what's going on here. But you can see that he's got an idea about what one of those prefabricated units would look like on the right. He's got a plan of a lamellar roof, a diamond pattern roof on the lower left. And on the top, he's showing little loops of steel reinforcing sticking out of the ends of one of those truss pieces. And the octagon is a very small amount of poured concrete that's going to grip onto all of those loops of rebar and essentially make all of these little precast Lego blocks into one solid unit. Right? He's found a joint that he's going to use to make a monolithic structure out of a lot of very, very small elements. And when you look at the construction photos from Maliano where he's building prototypes, this is exactly what he does. You can see that the units are these are sort of four bays of truss. There's a little void there. If you look closely, you can see the reinforcing sticking into the void. And now they're going to come along and fill that void with concrete. And as the concrete cures, it's going to grab onto all of those little bits of rebar and make a very monolithic joint. In 1939, he gets another commission for more hangars, these in Orbitello and Torre del Lago on the west coast of Italy. And in the construction photos from these, you can see a couple of interesting things. He's precasting the truss work on the ground, right? So we don't have to be pouring a lot of concrete up in the air. He's lifting them into place on cranes, and you can see that the formwork covers about like 1/8 of the entire structure, right? That is all the scaffolding that he needs to put these in place. Once that concrete's cured, he can remove that scaffolding, move it to the next bay, and repeat the process. So he's saved on timber formwork. He doesn't have to build the entire thing out of wood and then out of concrete. He's saved on timber scaffolding, because he only needs this little bay to pour one kind of unit at a time. And he's saved on reinforcing, because instead of solid concrete, he's built the roof out of trusses. And the trusses weigh less, which means that the support that holds all of these up carries less load, and therefore needs less steel. It's kind of miraculous transformation. And the results, aesthetically, are absolutely amazing, too. Another interesting thing that happens is as these are approaching completion, Nervi's construction documentation goes from sort of a guy on site taking photos to hiring a company called Studio Vasari, an architectural photographer in Rome known for shooting sort of high-end apartments, major sort of public spaces. Nervi realizes that there's something about these hangars, right? Something really, really beautiful about them that deserves better treatment than just like the guy on the site, right, documenting progress. And Vasari shoots these very famous photographs of the hangars before the sort of lightweight roof covering goes on. You can see that they're open trusses, very, very lightweight. You can see that things get sort of dense at the junctions. That's the reinforced concrete that's holding these pieces together. And you can see that they're now standing, instead of on the like 24 buttresses around the back, they're standing on 6 points, right? 6 buttresses that are just barely touching this roof. That's how lightweight, that's how much weight Nervi's saved with this precasting process. These were all blown up by the German army when they retreated. And there are 2 stories about that. One, the sort of official one, is that Nervi was heartbroken and that the shells actually bounced, right? They were so, the concrete did its work so well that the shells came down to the ground intact. The story that I've heard that I can't back up, but that I really want to believe, is that someone comes into Nervi's office and says, you know, the Germans have blown up the hangars, and Nervi says, thank God, you know, every day I've worried they were going to fall down on their own, right? I don't have to do that anymore, so. I wish I could corroborate that. Later on in his career when he's teaching at the University of Rome, Nervi, I think, sort of gets to the heart of the matter, though. As interesting a structure as those were, and as efficient a structure as those were, the real genius is that that second set of hangars was made with a very, very small workforce, very small and relatively unskilled. And the reason that Nervi could do this is that those trusses were incredibly lightweight. He's no longer moving tons and tons of liquid concrete around. He's moving around very, very light truss elements. To construct, he says, means to be able to move weights. And what weights can be hoisted into place? This is the question. He's talking about a viaduct here that he did in the late 50s. The factor of weight is tied very closely to economy. A crane to lift 17 tons costs 17 million lira. A crane to lift 23 tons costs 40 million lira. So this ethic of autarky, even though by the 1950s it's history in Italy, this has stuck with him. And Nervi is constantly looking for the most efficient way to build, the way to make things as light as possible, and the way to use the least equipment on the job site. Nervi e Bartoli, the contracting firm, was throughout its entire history very, very small. A couple dozen workers, mostly unskilled, and without the sort of huge construction equipment that you would have expected from a big sort of international firm. And this, I think, gets to the heart of why he was able to do that. He was constantly paying attention to what could be cast by a few construction workers and lifted into place by a small crane. All right, il cantiere, which in Italian means both the job site and the shipyard, one of these kind of useful mistranslations. It turns out that as Nervi was finishing up the hangars, he did a small project for the Italian Navy. The Navy came to Nervi's firm and said, we can't get the steel that we need for warships. We'd like to explore the possibility of building them out of concrete. This is not a new thing. This was something that was done even in the late 19th century. But Nervi was an innovative engineer and thought the problem through and managed to produce 3 or 4 hulls for the Italian Navy before the program was scrapped in 1943. And to do this, weight, of course, matters if you're building a hangar, but it matters even more if you're trying to float a ship, right? Weight is super important. And Nervi's designs for these boats show a material development that he would carry with him for the rest of his career, called ferro cemento. And you can see in the big section here, these ship hulls all have sort of beams and structure that runs across the hull. But if you look very closely, you'll see that the skin of the ship is actually very, very thin. And this detail that's on your left, if you blow it up, what you can see is that this is made up of a handful of reinforcing bars, very, very sort of scattered, much less than you'd expect to see in a typical concrete slab. And then sandwiched around those reinforcing bars, which kind of hold the basic shape of the ship, is wire mesh, which was a scrap material like the screens in your windows today, that the very, very small steel industry in Italy essentially treated as a waste product. And what Nervi realized is that if you layered that mesh together 7 or 8 times and sort of pushed lightweight cement through it, when that cement cured, what you would get would be a very, very thin, relatively pliable, and very sturdy plate, right? Plate that would look like concrete, but that would behave like steel. This on the right is a mock-up of ferro cemento made by students in the History of Italian Engineering program at University of Roma Due. And you can see that they've used reinforcing bars to get the basic shape. They've laid metal screen over that to get a kind of planar element. And then they've just literally mashed a really lightweight cement through that. And what you get, again, is it's like a hack, right? You're hacking cement into thinking that it's actually steel. It behaves almost like a steel plate. And so again, talking about similar projects, Nervi notes that prefabrication gets you only so far in saving weight, and that ferro cemento, this technique of making very, very thin, reinforced wire mesh plates out of concrete, saves you even more depth and saves you even greater weight, right? So 3 inches is the minimum thickness of reinforced concrete, but if we use ferro cemento, we can reduce this thickness to half, to 1.5 inches. And here you see a ferro cemento piece being put into place on a stadium in Rome, lifted by relatively lightweight tower cranes. These 2 ideas, prefabrication and ferro cemento, come together in a project that Nervi does right after the war in Turin. And it's this project, I think, that establishes the system Nervi, as it comes to be called, this combination of prefabrication, structural engineering, and ferro cemento. This is a project that the automakers in Turin, having been heavily bombed in World War II, wanted to announce to the world that they were kind of back, they were up and running. They realized too late that in addition to their factories, all of their exposition halls had been bombed. Nervi agreed to do the project and said that he could design and build it in 8 months. And to do this, he relied on these two principles, prefabrication and ferrocement. He built essentially hundreds or dozens of little concrete hulls, sort of like canoes, each of which was a sort of folded plate, right? If you remember, if you know your structures, you know that a folded plate kind of tricks a thin layer into thinking it's a really deep layer. Each one of these is small enough that it could be lifted by a crew of 4 or 5 people, could be trucked over to the site and put into place by the winch that you see there. Right? No tower crane on this site. It could be put onto a scaffold that, like the hangar at Orvieto, could be built discreetly, dismantled, moved along the hall and reused. And once in place, again using very small amounts of reinforced concrete in the sort of trough and at the summit of each one of these, Nervi could essentially turn this collection of concrete little canoes into a system of very thin arches, all stabilized by the walls of the individual units. And what's amazing to me about this is it's about 5 structural techniques at once. It's a long, shallow arch that acts kind of a little bit like a beam. It's a folded plate that, if you think of an I-beam, it has a flange at the top and the bottom, and a web where the window is that sort of takes the place of the centerpiece of a steel I-beam, which means it's a great shape and bending. And it's all prefabricated by a crew of about 20 people while the foundations of the building are being put into place. So he's saving 3 or 4 months of pouring concrete by being able to telescope these two things together. This is a different part of the building, but you get a sense for what the prefabrication looked like. There's a metal screen that's being bent over a clay mold, and that metal screen is then going to get a coating of cement that's going to get sort of jammed through it. They're going to let that cure, and then they're going to use, that's going to be the finished concrete hull that'll be put into place by the cranes. There's a shot of the casting yard. If you look closely, you can see that there's subtly different sizes so that the arch gets deeper and deeper as it gets to the center, where there's going to be a little bit more bending than at the edge ends. And here's the scaffolding drawing. This is maybe one of the keys to the whole project, is that Nervi, as the builder, had to think through the process. And so here he's thinking about what's the minimum amount of scaffolding that we can get away with. What's the smallest piece that we can build at one time? Once that cures, dismantle the scaffolding and very quickly move it to the next stage. There's one of the hulls being lifted into place. And on the right, you can see that with a very little bit of timber, and okay, granted, a pretty serious amount of reinforcing, but discrete, only in these little ribs. These two areas are going to get poured concrete that's going to form the top and bottom of these very, very shallow, what are really beam arches. And those will lock into place all of the little hull pieces and make this thin shell roof perform like a monolithic concrete shell. At the ends, you can see that the loads from those are getting gathered by these ferrocemento fans. And there's the result. If you look closely, you can see that the arches get deeper and deeper as they get toward the center, and then they get skinny and skinny as they get down toward the ends again. It's a 2-hinged arch, so it's allowed to flex a little bit at the bottom. And this also reflects the fact that it's not really an arch, it's also a beam. It's behaving in bending, and it's behaving in compression. Compression. You can also see that Nervi's bringing in daylight through the webs. The webs are where the roof is stressed the least, and so all of these have these windows that bring in this flood of daylight. And at the same time, you're looking at this amazing pattern, right, of this sort of rippling surface. You can see the kind of human scale comes from the size of a single unit that workmen are actually able to lift. So here's the overall roof. It was finished on time, under budget, and it was used for about 50 years, really until the turn of the century, as the sort of premier place for Fiat to show off its new models. It's a combination of poured concrete buttresses and this ferrocement hull roof. And then in the back, there's this very interesting apse that was the result of an old kind of architectural master plan. And Nervi uses a similar approach here. He uses prefabricated ferrocement pans But these ferrocement pans are actually tiled around a domed surface, very much like the Pantheon, right? The square coffering of the Pantheon gets smaller as it marches up. And here Nervi's designed a diamond-shaped pan that's going to get smaller in kind of families as it approaches the top. And what that leaves him with is a set of intersecting ribs that again are going to coffer the dome, make it behave like a dome that's much thicker, but with far less weight. Here you can see them making the pans on the left. There's rebar sticking up that's going to latch into a very, very thin poured concrete surface over the top. And on the right, this is the kind of surface of the dome that's about to get the concrete shell poured over the top of it. And there's the result, this kind of sunflower pattern that comes about from similar shapes being repeated at different scales as they march up the dome. Same process, essentially, as the main hall, but with a very different geometry. And it's this geometry that formed probably his most famous work, the Palazzetto dello Sport, in 1957. Again, on the left, you see these diamond-shaped pans. You see 3 or 4 workmen moving one to the job site on like a donkey cart, right? Not even on a tractor. And on the right, you see there's a single tower crane that's helping them lift all of these diamond-shaped pans into place. Once they're placed, there's a light reinforcing screen that goes over the top of them. Concrete locks all of those into place. They're held up on buttresses, just like the roof of the Turin Hall. And on the inside, you get this incredible kind of starburst sunflower pattern. And of course, you look at this and you think, you know, what genius designed this pattern? And the reality is that Nervi didn't design the pattern, he designed the process. He designed the way to make this out of discrete diamond-shaped units. The pattern emerges from all of that. There's no reflected ceiling plan of this building. Believe me, I've looked. There's a drawing that shows what the size of each pan needs to be, right? What each family of pans dimensions have to be. But Nervi never sat back and said, what would that look like if we put it, you know, all together? The first time anyone saw what that pattern would look like was when the building was completed. There in section, you can see that Nervi is thinking about how you understand the dome. He's lifting it up on these forked buttresses, and he's putting a glass wall between the sort of structure that makes up the seating and the dome that's kind of hovering overhead. What this does is it lifts the dome up. You come through or you see through the glass below. The dome really feels like it's just sort of been dropped from the sky, and it's sitting on these little points. This thing is, you know, nearly 50 years old, and every time I've taken someone in to see it, like it takes your breath away, even today. It's still one of the thinnest shells proportionally in the world. You can see that there's just that thin black line that represents the actual shell of concrete. And it's actually thinner than an eggshell, which means that there's so little weight in the dome that it can actually rest on these little points around the edges. And that also, of course, helps with the foundations, makes the buttresses smaller, et cetera. The other arena that Nervi did for the 1960 Olympics in the AUR is less famous, probably less beautiful, still really striking, but it doesn't get that kind of breathtaking response when you walk into it. This is the Palazzo dello Sport, right? Confusing pair of names. This one was built by taking the exact same process for the Turin Hall and sort of wrapping it around a dome. So taking these V-shaped concrete hulls and developing them in a sort of radial pattern that then could be rotated around the outside. You can see that there are also these fans that collect the loads from all of those so that people can walk around them. And on the inside, you get the sense that it's basically the Turin Hall like wrapped around a circle. Another incredibly, almost impossibly kind of lightweight, thin shell dome, and another project that's built by a crew of about 25 or 30. Right? Very, very lightweight elements, very, very easy to move into place, repetitive process that allows him to use relatively unskilled labor and to undercut all of his competitors. Nervi won 4 major commissions for the 1960 Games, and finally the Olympic Committee just like banned him from like competing anymore, right? They literally, there's a velodrome competition and they said it's open to everyone except Nervi. And almost as a way to like sign the building, the Palazzo, Nervi uses the diamond shape pattern of ferrocemento pans on the underside of the seats, right? So it's almost like he can't resist saying like, look what else I can do, right? And this to me, combined with this other technique that he had that I haven't mentioned, but is equally kind of interesting, these tapering curved surface columns that actually, if you look closely, are all made up of straight timber boards, right, that are just simply twisted. There's this miraculous way of taking cheap materials, unskilled labor, impossible budgets, and this being Italy, even more impossible schedules, right, and finding a way to really forge something that's incredibly disciplined and incredibly beautiful out of it. And just to show sort of where these go, late in his career, Nervi was still using these techniques. The Aula Paola, which is the audience hall, the indoor audience hall at the Vatican City, which took up most of his time during the late 60s, uses the same ribbed ferrocemento V's to enclose, one of the most sacred spaces in Rome. It's not used now because the Pope is so popular that they can't squeeze 10,000 people into this space. So when you go to Rome in a papal audience today, you don't get to see the Nervi building. You've got to go stand in the rain out in St. Peter's Square. It wasn't a problem with Benedict. It is a problem with Francis. And late in his career, Nervi was accused, and I think maybe rightly so, of having a hammer for a solution and therefore seeing every problem as a nail. And almost no matter what he gets hired for, you find these techniques sort of showing up again and again and again. So when he works with Harry Seidler on Australia Square, which is this round skyscraper in downtown Sydney, he uses this prefabricated ferrocemento for the lobby ceilings, right? Again, sort of a signature element that he almost can't resist using. So that comes toward the end of Nervi's career. He died in 1979. He himself had been relatively inactive for most of the 70s. His son, Antonio, the architect, died only 6 months later, and the office really sort of shut down after that. In a way, the office had sort of outlived its time. It had forged these incredibly beautiful things out of the constraints of autarky, and it had sort of continued those, found ways to continue building with those up through the early 70s. By the early 70s, though, there was a global market for steel. A younger generation of Italian engineers was using post-tension concrete, which uses large steel cables to take up big tensile loads. More importantly, they were just using steel full stop. The bridges on the famous motorway that runs from Milan to Naples, the first generation was built out of concrete, but after about 1960, all of the major bridges were built out of steel, and Nervi, celebrated as Italy's greatest engineer, built absolutely none of them. So the world sort of got away from these few techniques that Nervi had forged during his early career. Okay, ideas and things, some conclusions. Patterson is best known for this line, no ideas but in things. And this is sort of Williams' shot across the bow to high modernism, where he says that we need to get away from the abstractions of the 1920s, and we need to find beauty out there in the world, right? Out there in Paterson, New Jersey. For a long time, I would say that this has been my stance, right? That I'm a kind of nuts and bolts guy, and I like looking at actual things, actual stuff that's out there. And I think that there is certainly value in that. I've certainly found a lot of interesting things by poking around in basements, looking into column covers and under column covers and things like that. But I have to say that one of the things this year is that I think I also believe the opposite, right? That things only have meanings insofar as we can connect them with larger ideas. Nervi, if you sort of read him carefully, thought this as well. We think of him as a stuff guy, and most of the research that I've done really confirms that, right? He loved getting his hands dirty. He loved working in the experimental yard. He loved figuring out how to make concrete better. But maybe one of his greatest quotes, and this is from this series of lectures he gave as the Norton Lectures in Poetry at Harvard in 1961. He talks about the relationship between technology and aesthetics as being the relationship between the objective data of the problem, things, and the aesthetic sensitivity of the designer, ideas. And he talks about the designer being active, getting inspiration from those things and sculpting them, right? Trying to figure out what they can do with them, welcoming the suggestion that things give the designer, modeling them, emphasizing them, proportioning them in a personal manner which constitutes the artistic element in architecture. Ideas and things going back and forth, talking to one another, negotiating, arguing. One of the conversations that we had ongoing at the Academy, or that I enjoyed sort of latching onto, in the humanities there's this argument that goes under the rubric of texts versus stuff. And this is the people who read ancient texts for a living, arguing with the archaeologists who go out and dig things up. Turns out that those things almost never match, right? That there'll be a text that's about a battle somewhere, and the archaeologists will say it wasn't there, we've dug there, doesn't exist. This argument goes on and on and on, and it's one of these sort of things that is fantastic to listen into. But the more that I heard this sort of argument between text and stuff, the more it connected for me to this notion of ideas and things. The texts that scholars look at from ancient Rome, ancient Greece, these are all aspirational. They're the way that either people of the time or historians of later times want the world to be. The stuff that archaeologists dig up tends to reflect the world as it is. And none of us as designers should be surprised that those two things don't always match up. Ideas are aspirational. We have ideas that we would love to build out into the world. And when we go out there, we find that the economics don't work, or the labor, there's a labor shortage, or the materials that we thought could do one thing actually can't. There's a similarity then between the historians who look at aspirational texts and kind of real world stuff and designers who look at big ideas, right? Things that we want to make beautiful and the stuff that we actually have to make them work. And I think one of the things that this research starts to show is that there are things that happen in between. Things like patterns, right? Pattern in Nervi's case is not only the strategy for getting his ideas that are locked in his head out into the world, they're also the very real world ways to save money, right? To do things efficiently and effectively. The beauty of Nervi's work, the patterns in Nervi's work come out of the algorithms that the construction requires. And it's those patterns, I think, that we recognize as sort of imposing order on a program or on a job site or on a material that otherwise is sort of chaotic, right? Or that doesn't kind of do us any favors in the aesthetics world. This to me is kind of connects with what we do in this building every day, right? We as humans have got minds that can conceive of the beautiful, that can conceive of perfection. And these minds, unfortunately, are born into a world that is utterly indifferent to those desires. A world that stubbornly resists our desire for perfection at just about every turn. There are those that seek beauty in this asymmetry between our aspirations and the world that these take place in. And those, I think, that seek beauty in this asymmetry instead of in spite of this asymmetry, those people, like Nervi, can truly call themselves designers. Thank you. Deborah says we have a little bit of time for questions. This is a great question. Professor Connolly has pointed out that these are all individual units, the diamond pans, and yet what you see are monolithic beams. And in fact, Nervi had them all plastered over. The joints between them are plastered over. There's about an 1.5 inch gap between them, which allowed them to kind of jiggle them around and make sure they were in the right place. Interestingly enough, if I go back a little bit, on Australia Square, if you look very closely, you can see that the joint is actually there. You actually see it. And there's correspondence between Seidler and Nervi, where Seidler says, surely you don't mean to plaster these over, right? These tell you the whole story about how it was constructed. And Nervi, having plastered things over for the last 25 years, goes, oh yeah, of course, right? Like, what a great idea. So sometimes it takes architects to tell engineers what they're really thinking, right? But that's a great question because it gets to the heart of the fact that we see these as kind of monolithic shell structures, and yet the construction story is so important. And that kind of, the process that it goes through, something we as architects love to see exposed, and Nervi typically, let's see if I can get through it quick enough. Whoops, go back. Nervi typically wants to hide it, right? Until an architect comes along and says, you know, there's more to the story to tell. Yeah.
So there's no part of any of those hangers left, those beautiful hangers, is that correct? Any parts, pieces, any resemblance, anything?
Yeah, the question is there anything left of the hangars? There are a couple fragments of buttresses that exist both in Orbitello and in Orvieto. Orvieto is now a farm, and I was told in no uncertain terms that it was like not worth going to try to find. Orbitello, actually, it's fairly near the town. I haven't actually been, but what's left is kind of the boring bits, right? Not the roof shells, which came down and were just sort of carted off, but the kind of walls and little bits of the foundations are still there.
Images of them actually in use, occupied?
Oh yeah, yeah. The ones at Orbitello have these great shots of like Italian seaplanes, right? That are about to get shoved into the water, you know, to go like attack our guys, right? Okay. But no, they were used and they were successful. There were 2 generations of the second set of hangars that were built. Yeah.
Tom, I'm gonna, as much as I'd love to keep going, I'm gonna
Absolutely.
from you for
Yep.
a moment.
And the mic, more importantly.
I just have to say very quickly, I love this moment where Tom is getting giddy because of the archive work, right? It's like this moment where you see something in a drawing that somehow you knew and you needed to see that drawing to prove it. Tom, that was fantastic. You got excited. It was like, archive work. Anyway, again, one more round of applause for Tom. Thank you so much. And this concludes our premiere, and we invite you all out into the gallery to view the opening of the Rome exhibition. Please.